I'm going to go to a story that I think that you may have heard about. It's found in 1 Samuel 17. Now the Philistines were gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Succoth and Azekah and Ephesah. Well, we don't need to know where that is. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in lines of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and the Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley in between them. And there came out of the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail that weighed, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield bearer went before him. And he stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. And if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we'll be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." A familiar story? So this morning we want to take a look again at the life of David, King David, the first in the kingly line that leads us to Jesus, the first king to come out of the tribe of Judah. And so this morning I want us to take another look at a different portion of David's life. The scriptures tell us that David was a man after God's own heart, and I think it's important for us to try to figure out, what does that mean? How did he become like that? Wouldn't it be great if God could say that about us? We all dream that one day we'll make it to heaven and God will look down from his throne at us and say, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." Almost in a sense to say, "You're a man, you're a woman after my heart." What does God use to fashion us? Well, some of the things come at us and some of the things are inside us. But it's important, I think, for us to recognize that there are some things that help us in our journey to become a man after God's own heart. What sort of man was David? Well, there were many things that David was naturally good at. He was a naturally born leader. He was able to take over a situation very quickly, come to a decisive end. He drew to himself a whole number of people who were considered to be the cream of the crop, the best of the best. Made him soldiers in David's army, and then commanded them on success after success after success in the battlefield. He was a great leader, and people came to Israel because of that. He was also good at music. I have a number of friends who I consider to be Renaissance men who not only can fight and play hockey and do a lot of other things, but men who like poetry, like reading, like drawing, and a variety of other things. We have men like that in our church today, people who take pride in the things that they can accomplish, and it's such an important thing. David was a man like that, and David's special talents was putting to music the events of his life to help others to be able to navigate through those times. It's not easy being a musician. It's not easy being a poet, because when you're a musician or a poet, you lay it all on the line for other people. You say, "This is who I am. This is how I feel. Judge me or don't judge me. I can't help but tell you this is what I am like." David was also a servant. It's interesting that one of the characteristics of being godly is that we would be good servants. David was looking after the flock of his father because his brothers had gone away to war, and was doing a great job. He wasn't complaining about it. He wasn't saying, I don't want to do this and I'm not going to do this. He took on his task. He took on his purposes head on and became invaluable to his father. But there's more to that when it comes to being a servant who is a shepherd. Jesus even said that the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And so I think for David, he understood that. He knew what it meant to truly serve. Truly serving his father, truly serving his nation. He knew that it meant something for him to do those things in acts of service. Those are things that just naturally came out of David's character. And one of the things I think that helped him in his reputation and helped him in his life. But he wasn't a perfect man. He struggled with other things in life. One of them was fatherhood. We hear in another passage of Scripture that David had a son who rebelled against him and tried to kill him in the end. And it was that son that David had never ever said a cross word to in his life. In other words, David had never tried to correct his son in his life. That's a terrible thing to do to your child. A terrible thing to do to another person, to take that person and not give them the benefit of discipline, not give them the benefit of having another point of view put into their lives. David thought of fatherhood in that way. Maybe it was a result of being the eighth born in a family of 8 boys and just one sister. So he was the eighth born out of 9, but the last son to be born. Maybe at that point in time, Dad didn't have to say very much because the older brothers would be able to do everything, perhaps. But David certainly didn't do that lesson. I don't think David really understood the purpose of marriage, the purpose of setting boundaries around yourselves. And we see in his life again and again him slipping back into forms of marriage that weren't the kind that God wanted in his culture. And he didn't understand friendship. It even got to the point where he committed sin with one of his best friend's wives, caused her to become pregnant, sought to have this man killed in some way so that he could get rid of the trouble and trial. To David, that somehow fell upon people that he called his friend. He didn't seem to understand what that was like. This morning we want to take a look at an event that happened early in David's life because it reveals his character in a number of ways. Now, we're not sure of how old David might have been at this time. Armies of the day, especially Israeli armies, were made of people or men who were 20 years older or beyond that. Because David isn't doing military service in the midst of this warfare that they're having with the Philistines, I think the one thing that we can safely assume is that he was not as old as 20. Maybe he was 18 or 19 or whatever the case may be, but that's a relatively young person. He was probably running the estate as a senior would be able to run the estate, but every time that his brothers would return from battle and those kind of things, they'd simply take over and push him to the side. But he showed a good competence in that. This story is super familiar to us. As I was preparing, I thought, oh, they know, Lord. They know this story backwards and forwards. That's true, but maybe we could shed a little bit of different light on it this morning. Most people who grew up in a Christian or a Judeo-Christian background would be familiar with the story of David and Goliath, but many people, even outside the church, know this story, the David and Goliath story, when they talk about Walmart versus the small stores. That's a David and Goliath story. Or when they talk about the large manufacturers against the small, that's a David and Goliath. And the idea behind David and Goliath is the little guy is going to win, or the little guy at least has a chance to win. And so part of the background of this story is an understanding that with God's help, nothing is impossible. With God's help, we can achieve all that we desire to achieve because God is going to help us. So what kind of tools did David use in this battle that he had with the Philistine? First, it's good to know that David was someone who recognized a problem. He recognized that the nation of Israel was at war with a particular nation, in this case, the Philistine nation. Now, scholars are not in agreement about the Philistines. They don't agree where they came from, how many there were, and what their purposes were in the land of Israel. I kind of fall into one point of view, and I really think it makes sense in the story of the Philistines. They come from the Mediterranean Sea somewhere, probably from a fairly large island. I think that what happened to that island was a disaster, a large disaster that caused this people group, hundreds and maybe even thousands of them, to migrate off the sea and onto the coast of Israel. They start to show up in the scriptures around the time of Abraham. And so we know that they've been there for a long time. What are they looking for? They're looking for a place to live, a new place to live. They've got their backs against the wall. They can't return home. I wonder how many of us think in terms of what's happening down in the United States right now, where there's thousands of immigrants gathered at the border waiting to come in. They are desperate to come and settle down. They want all of the incentives and cash and security and peace and all of that the United States offers to them. They don't want to go home. In some cases, they can't go home because they've been stopped from doing that by their government. Once they leave their country, they're not allowed back anymore. Did you know that there were even immigrants from Africa who tried to make it across the Mediterranean into the south portion of Europe who couldn't make it? Some of them came over to Mexico and Guatemala and then tried to make it into the United States from the south as well. It creates all sorts of pressures, especially with the people who are already there. I'm living in my house. I don't need to share it with 10 other people, although they may be willing to share it with 10 or 20 other people. I can't do that. That's not the way I work. The problem isn't that this is a single engagement that we have between these two forces. This was an invasion that had been going on for hundreds of years, and people had still not moved very far from it. The problem was not just Goliath, but a nation in need. Now, early stages of war involved threats and skirmishes. I couldn't help but think about the war in the Ukraine and how much blustering there has been over that. Oh, we're going to we're going to have an offensive back at your offensive, and we're going to destroy you, and you can try and destroy us, but you never. A lot of those words are blustery words. They're words that soldiers in the ranks don't like to hear because they know it could cause trouble to them. But they don't. They want to go home. They want to get out of there in the worst way. And so there's always threats and skirmishes that happen at the beginning of a battle, at the beginning of a war. And that's what we find happening in this valley at this point in time. The Philippines had a champion named Goliath. Now, I don't know whether you believe it or not, but I believe in the size of Goliath. He was a huge, huge man. He carries with him, and his family line carries with him genetic markers that help us to understand and know that this man had some sort of a way of growing that was unnatural to some of them. There was a fellow named Robert Wardlow who died in the last century, in the early 20s, I believe. Any guess on his height? 8'11". Some people think that the height of Goliath was 9'6" or something like that. I don't know. I don't know if things are that accurate. But this Goliath was a huge man. And not only was he big and tall and imposing, Robert Wardlow also was a sportsman. He played basketball, he played football, he played a number of other sports as well, and was able to do quite well at those things. He was strong, he was mighty. And so the picture shouldn't just be of one Philistine. The picture should be of 8 or 10 or 20 Philistines. His armor bearer was there, and if you have an armor bearer, you need somebody who can repair things, you need somebody who can sharpen things, you need somebody who can locate things and find things and pick up things. And there may have been at least 8 or 10 or even 20 men gathered around this Philistine, getting ready to fight. Now, most of us know the story. David is sent by his father to visit his brothers at the lines of battle, and so he goes. It's not the first time. He obviously knows his way around. He finds his way to the quartermaster to be able to deliver some food to them, and then he goes to talk to them in battle. When David is there, Goliath does one of his, probably in the morning, does one of his walk-around talks kind of thing. He says, God, anybody out there who wants to fight, you come and fight me. If you beat me, we'll serve you. If I beat you, though, you have to serve us. Goliath would say this morning after morning after morning, trying to scare the nation of Israel, trying to get them to run away from the battle lines because they wouldn't want anything to do with an army that has a champion like Goliath. David gets consideration in this because somehow Saul is understanding that David is doing something different and something particular. And so he offers him his own armor, Saul's armor. Now, sometimes we forget how big a man Saul was. It was said that one of the things with Saul is he was a head higher than anybody else in the nation of Israel. So if the average height was 5'10", Saul is 6'10". He's not a small man. And so when David comes to try on the armor, it's not going to fit him. He's not built for that kind of battle. Our little puppy got into a fight with a pit bull. Pit bulls are designed to fight. They do a really, really good job at fighting. Border collies are good at running around. And unfortunately, fighters and running around, if they get a hold of you, they could hurt you. And certainly our little puppy got a little bit hurt that night, but everything's going good now. But it's the same thing. Certain people are designed certain ways, and they need to use their skills in a certain way as well. David chooses what is familiar to him. He chooses the sling. And he says, I've killed both the bear and the lion using the sling. Now, for years and years and years, we've been taught that this is a David and Goliath story. That David had no chance at all with Goliath. But the truth be known is, at that time there were people who could shoot the slingshot with their right hand and their left hand with the same accuracy. In fact, some of Saul's men were able to do that. There's a verse in the scripture that tells us that a certain person could take a sling and sling a rock and catch a hare, cut a hare in half. So when David is going up to face off against Goliath, it's not a match that's that unequal. There are points for David and there are points for Goliath. So Goliath, I think, takes him seriously. And it's not luck. it's the hand of God, I believe, that comes and allows David to take that rock and at least knock out, if not kill, Goliath. It was something that was not necessarily a guarantee, but it was not something that was unexpected. But the message, I think, is clear in that. And that is that when you are trained in something, trust in that training. When you've been schooled in something, trust in that schooling. I was a volunteer fireman for 8 years. Part of my job was as a first responder, although I was trained on air brakes and hoses and ladders and all the technical stuff that's involved with fighting fires and all of those things. Not only that, because I lived in town, I was given the opportunity and took it to be a first responder. So I got to go to all sorts of courses on first aid and automatic electronic defibrillators and all sorts of things that were necessary to be used. We even learned about forest fires and other things as well. And I had a lot of training, but I never used my training, very rarely anyways. When I moved to Saskatoon, I ended up being able to play in a 60-plus hockey league, which was a blessing. And because it was a wise league, they had opportunity for people to get first aid and AED training. And because I'd had it in the past, I thought it would be great to carry through and keep on going. And so I took the AED course. Again, never expecting to use it, but about 2 weeks after that, one of our players in his 70s collapsed at center ice. We rushed out to try and do what we could do. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that. You do not feel prepared. And I was on my knees looking around, waiting for that brave soul to break through and say, I'll look at it, I'll look after it, and then I could just relax, but nobody came at that point in time, so I took over the lead. I was able to cut his uniform on, put the paddles on him. We charged him 3 times, and he lived from that experience on. I was fortunate. I was able to get a St. John's Ambulance award for that. Not because of anything great and special, but simply because I remember kneeling over this man saying, Lord, you've got to help me. All I know is what I've been taught. All I know is what's going on right in front of me. I don't know whether this is going to work or not. I've never done it before. Help me. And I put the paddles on, and he walked again, and that helped him. That's a great comfort. David is prudent. David goes to the stream and picks not 1 stone, he picks 5 stones up. Why? Because he might miss with one. It's not like David's never missed with a sling and a stone before. But this is an opportunity, this is a time for him. He can't stop the battle in the middle and say, oh, I got to get some more stones, give me 5 minutes. No, he has to be prepared, and he is prepared. Now, the scene is dramatic. David faces off against this towering monster with weapons and shields and cloth and pomp and ceremony and others looking after him. David comes with sling in hand, shares some very important words with the Philistine, and then takes the sling out and slings and catches him in his forehead, and Goliath drops down to the ground. He was probably close to death at this time, but we don't know for sure. What solidifies the victory, though, is that David goes out and takes Goliath's sword and finishes up the job. I always like to think this way when we're approaching these kind of things, is if David hadn't gone forward and severed Goliath's head from him, and Goliath had died a natural death out there, it wouldn't have created the confusion and the apprehension of the troops that were there from the Philistines. What might have happened in that instance is Goliath's big friend Tiny, could have walked up and said, Goliath wasn't feeling very well today, he had a bad day at the plate. Sorry he took the baseball right in the middle of the head, but don't worry, I've got the bat now and I'm going to look after it and take over it. Goliath, he was just a baby. But David dashes to the front because he recognizes, he knows he's been in this kind of a situation before where he needs to act to make sure that things happen. You ever worked or dealt with a wild animal? They don't give up. For them, everything is life and death. And for Goliath, I think everything was life and death for him as well. And so David severs Goliath's head from his body, but that's only one down. That's only one down. There's a mountainside filled with the people, with the Philistines, waiting to still go forward. They're not ready to give up. But when the nation of Israel turns around and says, for David and for our God, we want to look after things and take care of things, and they begin to chase the Philistines begin to break ranks, and they fall apart, and David's army, the army of Israel, is able to take them on and overcome them. We can look at this story and see those things that were part of David's character. His inner bravery, his ability to lead and to see people come. His ability to trust in the things that he had been trained in and to make sure that he followed through on all of the things that he had learned. And as well, he learned that he needed to finish the job in order for it to be something effective and good. I think we can also learn how to allow our character gradually to shift closer and closer to the likeness of God. That's the purpose of the Holy Spirit in our life. He desires us to be like Him. May the Lord bless His word to us today.